What was being speculated for days finally turned into reality on Thursday. US President Donald Trump signed an executive memorandum that would impose tariffs on Chinese imports worth up to $60 billion. Is this the start of a global trade war? And is India prepared to weather this very storm? Good evening and welcome to this special broadcast. I'm Kritika Saxena and with me is Ronojoy Banerjee. Ron, interesting turn of events in the last 24 hours.
Well, as Nomura said in their notes earlier this evening, Kritika, that Trump's bark turned out to be worse than his bite. Well, now, America now claims that the tariffs have been imposed in retaliation to unfairly acquired U.S. intellectual property by China. The tariffs have been imposed following an investigation of Chinese policies ordered by U.S. President Donald Trump in August last year. Donald Trump claimed the tariffs would, and I quote, make U.S. a much stronger, richer nation. According to U.S. government officials now, United States Trade Representative will be publishing a list of targeted products in the next 15 days. Trump's latest move has spooked markets across the world who are now viewing it as a trigger that could escalate into an all-out trade war between two of the world's largest economies. Meanwhile, Wilbur Ross, America's Commerce Secretary, however, told CNBC earlier today that he does not think there will be a trade war with China resulting from President Donald Trump's latest tariff. Have a look.
We have right now an $800 billion trade deficit with the world. So think of that. So let's say we have 500 to 375, but let's say we have 500 with China, but we have 800 total with the world. That would mean that China is more than half. So we're going to get it taken care of. Just use the word reciprocal. If they charge us, we charge them the same thing.
There you have it from the president. Mr. Trump has announced $60 billion worth of tariffs on Chinese imports. He said it was the first of many measures designed to penalize China for practices that include stealing of American intellectual property. Now, despite praising the relationship, as you heard there, between his administration and President Xi, Mr. Trump said he will consider further action in 2 weeks' time. Now, speaking on CNBC, the Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross said he did not expect a full-blown trade war with China from the tariffs.
I think there will be some ultimate retaliation, but I don't think it's going to be the end of the earth. Think about it. The 60 billion figure that the president mentioned and that you quoted is a tiny fraction of our economy and a tiny fraction of the Chinese economy. So it's not as though we're blowing them up.
Wilbur Ross doesn't believe that there will be a trade war yet, but meanwhile, China has said that it will retaliate against the tariffs imposed by the U.S. The country has urged the United States to pull back the tariffs, saying that it does not want to get into a trade war. However, Beijing has clarified that it is not afraid of a trade war and has identified more than 100 American products that it will impose duties on if the U.S. goes ahead with tariffs on Chinese steel and aluminium. CNBC's Martin Tsung filed this report earlier.
Looks like a return salvo from China announced by Beijing 7 o'clock this morning here in the Chinese capital. Note, though, China's retaliating specifically against U.S. 232-related steel and aluminum tariffs, which are set to be enforced tonight to Asia time, and not in response to the 301 IP-related tariffs announced by President Trump in Washington overnight. So, in other words, no action against things like soybeans or Boeing aircraft. Overall, very modest, just $3 billion worth, so a fraction of the up to $60 billion announced by President Trump overnight. And take a look. Here's the breakdown. We've got some graphics here for you. Tariffs of between 15 to 25%. You can follow along here as we continue talking about this. And China, meantime, also responding to not just the tariffs, but the motive behind the U.S. tariffs, that China has been ripping off U.S. intellectual property for decades. Take a listen.
China encourages innovation. Chinese laws protect intellectual property rights. This applies to Chinese companies and American companies and other companies alike. We will do our utmost to make sure that intellectual property rights are protected, whether they are from Chinese companies or American companies. At the same time, I hope people here will understand, will realize people in China and people in other developing countries are also fully capable of innovation.
So the Chinese ambassador to the United States, they're sounding polite, yes, diplomatic, but maybe also a bit huffy. Martin Sung, CNBC.
Well, we will be joined by a stellar panel in just a bit. Jim O'Neill, former chairman of Goldman Sachs Asset Management, Jayant Dasgupta, former envoy of India to the WTO, and political and economic affairs expert Einar Tangen. And of course, our very own Shereen Bhan will be joining in to take us through that discussion. But before that, Ron, how is India responding to this?
Well, so far, Commerce Minister Suresh Prabhu has said that India remains in a wait-and-watch mode as the trade war escalates. Speaking with the media, Minister Suresh Prabhu said that India will respond appropriately if it faces any unilateral action by any country. Meanwhile, former RBI Governor Raghuram Rajan has warned that this crisis could indeed derail the global economic recovery.
India is a firm believer in a rule-based, transparent, participatory trading system. And to ensure that it happens, it functions properly, we had invited 53 countries and they have again appreciated India's role into doing that. As we are doing it multilaterally, we also do it bilaterally. We honor all our commitments and we live by the letter, not just letter, by the spirit of it. If any countries take any unilateral action, we'll definitely have taken note of it and will deal with it appropriately.
There are very worrisome scenarios here, so I think we should not take this lightly. I do hope that better sense sort of prevails and we move off from a full-fledged, process of one country doing it and the other country reacting and so on. I don't want to use the word trade war. I don't think we're there yet. But I do think that it's very important that we stay away because it could harm the current recovery, which has been beneficial all over the world significantly.
Raghuram Rajan says that the current recovery could be affected if this does get into a full-blown trade war. So the questions here are, will this escalate into a full-blown trade war, or are we in the middle of one already? And more importantly, is India really prepared to tackle if such a situation really arises? To take this discussion forward, we are now joined by Shereen Bhan, live from the Global Digital Summit in Kerala. Hi Shereen, over to you.
Well, thanks very much, guys. Yes, we're now joined by Jayant Dasgupta, the former Indian ambassador to the WTO, and political and economic affairs commentator Einar Tangen. We'll also be joined by Jim O'Neill, the former chairman of Goldman Sachs Asset Management, in just a bit. But Mr. Dasgupta, you know, there's two camps. One camp that believes that President Trump's bark has been worse than his bite. There's another camp led by people like Raghuram Rajan who are genuinely concerned and believe that we shouldn't take the actions that the Trump administration has taken lightly. Which camp do you belong to?
I think it would be very difficult to, belong to one camp or the other. But I would subscribe to the notion that whatever President Trump has been announcing in the recent past, especially in relation to the escalation of tariffs on steel and aluminium, I don't think it has been followed through to the last word, because President Trump just yesterday, I think, has exempted 7 countries, the European Union, Canada, Mexico, yes, Brazil, Argentina, Australia, South Korea. So that takes about 67% of the US imports of steel. So effectively, only 1/3 of the US's steel imports are going to be subject to tariffs from midnight today, US time. So I think the announcement which was made right at the beginning and then the soft pedaling a little bit, that shows that President Trump probably will bow to reason and wiser counsel from his advisors, and he will not take it to the ultimate point.
Well, except that his advisors keep changing every single day. Today we've seen the National Security Advisor change. But let me go across to Einar. You know, we've seen China say that, look, we're going to retaliate. $3 billion worth of tariffs is what China is looking at this point in time. But given the fact that, as Mr. Dasgupta pointed out, we saw the Trump administration now providing those exemptions to a lot of the allies, do you believe that this is, in a sense, the U.S.'s way of getting China to make some compromises, and you believe that this is going to reconcile at some sort of middle ground?
Well, it's hard to tell the future, but I think you have to keep some other things in mind. First off, when Trump announced the steel and aluminum tariffs, understand that China is the fourth largest exporter of aluminum and isn't even in the top 8 of steel directly to the United States. So it would seem kind of odd that he was shooting his friends first in an effort to target China. But he loved the idea and the result. When he announced that, it changed the conversation in Washington away from a lot of the troubles he's currently facing. And it did something else which really boosted his ego, which is all of a sudden all of these trade groups, all of these countries, leaders, everybody was calling Donald Trump. And this is something that very much appeals to him. He likes to be the man in charge. He likes to be the person who's calling the shots. And he's very amenable when you approach him on a one-on-one basis. He says, oh, what can we do? He's a deal maker, and he senses that. But he wants something in return. He says, well, you owe me one, this kind of stuff. So the other part of this is that this really he needs to get away from this conversation that's going on. And, you know, he has 3 women who are accusing him of sexual things, and 2 of them say that they slept with him, had unprotected sex. I mean, it goes on. It's a tabloid version. Then you have Robert Mueller on the other side, who's closing in, saying that he wants to interview Donald Trump. He's sent him a list of questions. There's the turmoil in the White House itself. So in terms of China, China is only responding with the $3 billion to this first foray. That's the steel and aluminum tariffs that were things. We have not seen what they're going to do with the $6 million. We have 15 days to figure out what the U.S. is actually going to do, but I can almost guarantee you that China will respond leg for leg on this particular one, because they can't afford not to. They don't want to be seen as weak, as accommodating Donald Trump. They're more than willing to sit down, but if he wants to start a trade war, it's going to get bloody.
If he starts a trade war, it's going to get bloody. Jayant Dasgupta, you know, several interesting points that we heard there from Einar. The fact that, you know, this could be a diversionary tactic to, on the part of Donald Trump to change the narrative from the domestic issues that the administration faces. But B, on the issue of the 301-related tariff imposition that the administration is talking about, do you foresee that becoming a bloody war? I mean, we had Wilbur Ross saying that we're not trying to blow up the earth, but do you believe that that potentially could be the big worry?
I do feel that usage of the 301 provisions and the U.S. memorandum which has been issued yesterday, that could you know, lead to an escalation, because the U.S., if it targets $60 billion worth of Chinese imports into the U.S., the Chinese could also, in their second shot at it, could raise their tariffs on an equivalent amount of U.S. exports to China. And that would then really, you know, be joining the battle, so to say. As far as the 301 is concerned, you know, the dispute settlement understanding of the WTO does not allow for retaliation without seeking the, you know, first recourse to the dispute settlement of the WTO. And only after the WTO allows it, retaliation or, you know, raising of tariffs can take place, which the U.S. has not done. This is something which has been plaguing the WTO as an if question since the late 80s and early 90s. What if the U.S. goes ahead and imposes tariffs unilaterally?
Yes. You know, Einar, just to take that WTO point forward, because this existential crisis that faces the World Trade Organization is real now. And there's also a disconnect and a dissonance in the manner in which the U.S. is dealing with the WTO. For instance, when it comes to India, the U.S. has decided to move the WTO and engage in a dispute, consultation process. Whereas on the other hand, when it comes to China, they've decided to move unilaterally. So is there really, do you believe that the WTO is relevant at all in the manner in which the Trump administration intends to go about trade?
Well, this is the big question that everybody is wondering about, and this is something that affects India in terms of how they're going. What is the world going to be like without the WTO? I mean, India and China and many other countries, ASEAN, have been experiencing very wide growth. There's a massive move of GDP. 2001, the world GDP is $50 trillion. You go forward 15 years, it's expanded to $112 trillion. And most of that growth did not come for Europe and America. The largest growth was for all the rest, not just China. So the WTO was very, very beneficial. If the United States has, and it seems that it's decided that the WTO was unfair, just like NAFTA is unfair, the UN is unfair, climate change is unfair, anything that is not solely dominated by the U.S. is unfair, then you have a real problem. And this is not just going to be China's problem. It's going to be everyone. It's because Europe still adheres to the WTO. They believe the trade is good. The only one who's really saying that they don't like this, they want to take their ball and go home, is the United States. The question is, will the rest of the world suddenly say, look, there's a rising China that's, 15% of GDP that's growing at 6.5% to 7% a year. You have India that's growing. These are the big markets. Why do we need the U.S.? And this is the real danger for the U.S., that it becomes marginalized by its own actions, by radicalizing this thing. Already, Trump has proven himself to be a very unreliable partner. That's according to his closest allies. So it's very hard to see. In diplomacy and business, reliability is key. You cannot plan if you don't know what the other person's going to do, and you can't predict it. And this is one of the issues with Trump.
Yeah. Well, that certainly is one of the issues with the Trump administration. Jim O'Neill joining us as well. Jim, one, of course, is the fact that, a tweet a day changes the perspective that the United States has and the Trump administration has on many issues, including trade. But I want to ask you now, given what we have seen them announce when it comes to measures against China, and Wilbur Ross telling CNBC that this is only the first set of steps and more action will follow if China were not to comply with what the U.S. is looking for, which could include things like production cuts, etc. What do you foresee, Jim, from here on?
Well, to be quite honest, I'm not sure. As we see virtually every week, trying to figure out what this US president is going to do about virtually anything is close to impossible. Quite where he's getting his economic advice from, I have no idea. It's kind of crazy. A lot of the issues that they try, and it's almost definitely for some domestic social media audience rather than to have a sort of economic impact and genuinely thinking about the health of the future of the US economy, because the kind of issues that they focus on are about 20 years out of date. I mean, we live in a world where the most highly valued American company, Apple, sells more iPhones to Chinese consumers than US consumers. This is a sort of ridiculous thing for the United States to do, in my view. Doesn't make any sense.
Let's assume that he intends to follow through with what has been announced. So far, and we don't know whether we'll see a tweet tonight or maybe over the next few hours, but let's assume that he goes through with what has been announced so far, which is $60 billion that the US is announcing and $3 billion which is what China intends to retaliate with. What impact is that likely to have as a first step?
So I think just as I just heard the end of the previous guest you was chatting to, I sort of agree. The underlying issue is the bigger one. I think is the initial impact. It's not going to be much. You know, part of why I said this is 20 years out of date. China's overall current account surplus is about 1/8 of the size it was 10 years ago. It's less than 2% of GDP. And their exports to the United States are much smaller as a percentage of GDP than they were 10 years ago. And linked to your own country, India, where we are slowly moving to a world where the United States doesn't dominate the world economy or world trade. So this is essentially almost shooting themselves in their own foot. It's sort of, you know, it's crazy. I just don't get, you know, 30 years ago, maybe, but today it's just a sort of gimmick that isn't very sensible, but obviously upsets the financial markets because who knows where it will stop. And I am assuming that you won't have other more rational countries trying to do the same thing between China and themselves, because that would be of much greater concern. But in some ways, this is essentially isolating the US, as we see on issues to do with climate change and no doubt some other issues too. It's kind of crazy.
So it's kind of crazy, but for now, at least on the back of what we've heard from both the US and China, the impact is likely to be limited. And I'm caveating that for now because we don't know what's going to happen next. But, you know, I want to, Jim, talk to you about one of the other issues. And we've just got another tweet from President Trump saying that he may, in fact, veto the spending bill. So, you know, what's your outlook now as far as global growth is concerned? Because that's been moving along quite nicely. It's been looking strong. Momentum has been picking up. How concerned would you be about whether it's these, you know, trade skirmishes that could escalate into a full-blown war or other global issues that could impede the growth that we're seeing currently?
Well, to be honest, I feel a bit less sure than I have done for some time. Last time I spoke to you, I was very much part of this camp that I have been for many, many months, that all the indicators I'm used to looking at have been and remained very strong, suggesting we certainly came into 2018 with world GDP growth well above 4%. But you've got three things in the past week all going on at the same time. You have this crazy protectionist populist stance against China in the US. Of course, we have signs from the Federal Reserve Board that if growth weren't to slow anyhow, they're going to be raising interest rates slightly faster than before over the next 2 years. And then thirdly, and the thing that's perhaps of most concern, which is not getting any headlines, is actually the European economic data this week has been slightly disappointing for the first time in many, many months. So maybe we shouldn't dismiss that some of the momentum that has driven the world economy so much the past year is slowing a little. I quickly add that the Chinese data we've had has been surprisingly strong. So I wouldn't want to get carried away. But I think there is some evidence that world momentum has slowed, even without this craziness in Washington.
Okay, so some headwinds emerging. But, Einar, you know, what's the mood you think in China? You know, President Trump obviously hoping that this pushes the Chinese into a corner and that they could arrive at some sort of a compromise. But what's the mood here? Xi Jinping just been elected to office for life, possibly. What do you think the mood is now? And what would that mean in terms of a Chinese response?
I mean, I think...
Okay, let's separate this down into different levels. First off, the Chinese people have one of the highest confidence levels in their government in the world. It's almost 80%. You start looking at the U.S., it's dropped places. It's now in the 30 to 40%. In terms of who's pushing that. I just want to answer a quick aside. Mr. O'Neill asked who's his economic advisor. It's Wilbur Ross, Navarro, and Lighthizer. And they have been very, very clear about how they feel about this. They've targeted China. They're China hawks. They're very protectionist and all of that stuff. So putting that aside, going back to China, at the upper levels, they're scratching their head. They don't understand why Trump is doing this, because it's a no-win situation. China has so many different leverage points when it comes to the U.S. Not only does it hold over $1 trillion worth of treasuries, it has it takes in 40% of the soybean crop that is grown in the United States. It takes in 15% of the wheat. I mean, you can go down the line. There are industries which could be seriously hurt. And interestingly enough, what they all have in common is that they're in areas which voted very heavily for Trump. So they're scratching their head. What is he trying to do? I think there is some traction to this idea that he's trying to get attention and change the narrative, because he's going to be getting, over this next 15 days, he's going to be getting all sorts of phone calls from leaders or things. 45 of the largest trade groups and business groups have said, we're opposed to this, Mr. Trump. They signed open letters. He's getting calls from Republicans. He's getting calls from heads of state around the world. The Chinese are trying to have a dialogue with him. And I think this attention is very, very much welcome, especially as we all know, he's undergoing a lot of turmoil at home with the White House, the lawsuits by the ladies, and the Russian investigation. It just doesn't make sense. I agree with Mr. O'Neill. It's just everyone is scratching their head. How does this work out for the American people? How does this work out for Donald Trump? If he starts hemorrhaging jobs, I mean, you could see a mass, defection in which the Democrats take over the House and the Senate in large enough numbers that it could be really, really dangerous to him. I mean, the Republican Party itself is very allied to business. And, once they start seeing jobs disappearing and layoff notices from companies, it's going to have a real impact.
So I'll end by asking you, Jim O'Neill, we've got a lot of new people in the White House now. Peter Navarro, of course, has made it absolutely clear that the U.S. does need to go after China. But do you believe that, given the points of leverage that Einar just pointed out for us, that the Chinese can exercise if they choose to, that perhaps we'll see the narrative shift and the narrative change, but this not translate into a full-blown trade war?
Well, one can hope so, but let me throw another angle in to finish that. Economics is a social science, but there's certain parts of it which are pretty factual and mathematical. The U.S. current account deficit basically reflects the fact that the U.S. saves very little and it needs capital from overseas. And unless the U.S. does something to change its savings rates, just by making stupid noises about placing a few tariffs against China and trying to appeal to some social media opinion polls in internal American inland states, is not going to change that. All it will mean, if in the unlikely event that it had any impact significantly on Chinese trade, it would just mean the US starts importing more from Vietnam or Bangladesh or somewhere else. I mean, it just defies any kind of logic, and that's why obviously the other gentleman mentioned about the advice. I know who these supposed advisors are, but they obviously haven't studied any sensible economics, because it's ridiculous.
Well, Jim O'Neill, Jayant Dasgupta and Einar, we'll have to leave it there. Appreciate you joining us here to discuss the implications of the action that Donald Trump has decided to take against China and what that could mean potentially for the global economy and whether we are, in fact, in the midst of a trade war. For now, from all of us here, goodbye. Many thanks for watching.